stressed simplification as emphatically as I could. Well, around 1939 or 38, a disaster happened in the United States. The cranberry crop was poisoned right on Thanksgiving, almost 1 week before Thanksgiving Day. I mean, this was sacrilege. The cranberry crop was poisoned either by a herbicide or a pesticide, and people had to run around looking for cranberries to make cranberry sauce with their turkeys on Thanksgiving Day. And I said, here's a lesson that people will not forget. Let me write something on it. So I started out and I wrote a whole book called Our Synthetic Environment, where I went through all the kinds of diseases you can get without any doctors being able to diagnose it, where I went through the whole question of simplifying the planet, where I went through agriculture and demanded that we turn more and more toward organic forms of agriculture. Now, you've got to know that hardly anybody was talking about this. And I take great pride in that fact that, you know what I mean, that these were fairly innovative ideas. And I talked about the way in which we were raising not only crops, but poultry, beef, animals in general, farm animals, as well as the cruelty, the stresses we were suffering in urban life, the problems being produced by nuclear reactors and radiation. I went through the whole gamut of everything that could be wrong with our society and interpreted it from an ecological viewpoint and related it to, essentially, the need to grow or die, and finally concluded with the chapter called Decentralization. And here I take a great deal of pride in something. I advocated the use of solar energy, wind power, water power, geothermal energy, alternative forms of energy to fossil fuels and nuclear fuels. And that's just right at the end of it. And called for an entirely new dispensation, a new society, basically, to live in harmony with the natural world, and using these alternative techniques. I feel it's only fair to add that MIT had dismissed Massachusetts Institute of Technology after exploring solar energy years ago, had dismissed it and said it was utterly worthless and you couldn't use it. It couldn't compete with fossil fuels. That wind power had been abandoned after an attempt was made at Grandpa's Knob during the early part of the Second World War to test the possibilities of wind power. It was written off. And I argued, and I can say at least that was reasonably innovative, I argued for an alternative technology, or what I called an eco-technology. And I made this blanket condemnation of the whole relationship of capitalism to the environment. In 1962, it was published by Knopf, one of the most outstanding publishers in the United States, Alfred A. Knopf, at that time the publisher, allegedly. And 6 months later, Rachel Carson came out with Silent Spring and swamped whatever readership I could have gained, although the book sold well, mainly among the scientific community, I may say, and less so among the public. Nobody could compete with Rachel's wonderful rhetoric, her poetry, her ability to arouse passions, and she had a following, at least of 5 million readers, I'd say, to begin with. She did not make by any means that wide-ranging critique that I did, and that was seen very clearly by writers like René Dubos, who were outstanding environmentalists in later years, and others who praised the book and seemed to think that it was more comprehensive than Rachel's book. But Rachel did a wonderful job, Rachel Carson, in Silent Spring. She alerted people to the danger of pesticides. Her main focus was on birds, and her secondary focus was on human beings. But human beings, even if placed in a secondary focus, will be concerned about what they're going to use in the way of a spray if a mosquito comes into the house. And people were using sprays and lavishing, extolling chemistry all over the place. DuPont came up with its own slogan, for a better world, for better things and a better world through chemistry. They then dropped the word through chemistry, if I'm not mistaken. Years later, it became a dirty word. But this awareness, shall I say, the idea that we were not going to immediately face the kind of chronic crisis or have the kind of depression we had in the 1930s, that awareness, that need to broaden, go beyond the class analysis, which I had when the workers' movement was still very vibrant. The need to try to integrate ideas into a new form where we would learn, where at least I had learned from the experiences of highly centralized parties like the Communist Party, and for that matter even attempts to centralize like the Trotskyist parties, which still retain the centralistic tradition of the old Bolsheviks, and still further the experiences of the Russian Revolution and the wars that had taken place, that whole hectic period from 1917 up to 1945, that what was called, I think by Barrington Moore Jr., the 30 Years' War of the 20th century. So many millions of people were killed, and it seemed like anything could happen, both devastatingly and both optimistically, both pessimistically and optimistically. All of that led me to try to form an integrated view that I felt would lead to social changes without producing bureaucracies, such as unfortunately the Russian Revolution had done. It had produced bureaucracies. Not relying on one class, which incidentally was dwindling anyway, namely the industrial working class. Trying to raise broader issues that had vast cultural implications about the human spirit, about an ethical society. Foster a participatory democracy, to use the language of the 60s. Not just simply what is euphemistically called a representative democracy, an oxymoron, because you don't have the people ruling through representatives up there making decisions for them. A challenge Rousseau had made in the social contract 200 years earlier. That the people have to be in a face-to-face relationship to have a true democracy. Recognizing that both ecology and a very emancipatory vision of society require decentralization. I don't mean into little huts in the mountains, but I mean real, well-developed, clearly defined communities which could meet in face-to-face assemblies and then confederate. Instead of forming nation-states pyramidically, from a pyramidal viewpoint, running top to the top, running the bottom, actually have a confederation, which I knew had existed in the past. And I was later to write a whole book about the history of confederations as distinguished from centralized nation-states and centralized parties. And thereby working within these frameworks, I realized that the views I were advancing came more from an anarchist tradition than from a Marxist tradition. And I added on the word eco-anarchism, or at least somebody did for me, added on the word eco-anarchism, and speaking of what I believed in, because I was now writing. I was writing pamphlet after pamphlet and book after book. And finally calling for something more basic than just the abolition of classes and the abolition of exploitation, which were important to abolish. But I said, I wanted to argue it's important to abolish hierarchy, status, not just economic power, but also a kind of psycho-institutional power of status, hierarchy. In other words, rule, domination, not only exploitation. I raised the question in my own mind, it would be perfectly understandable that you could have a classless society and a non-exploitative society and have bureaucracies everywhere. And even if they didn't have material privileges, they had psychosocial privileges, self-esteem, call it whatever you like, that came from dominating people, even though, as in Plato's Republic, the guardians deny themselves everything, but they rule. They get out of the flesh pots. They live austere lives in the Republic, in Plato's Republic. They're the ones who think, who have very, shall we say, sparse diets, the Spartan way of living, but they rule. And that's what counts, you see. They rule.